Hey there. Tonight, we step back to a bright cold morning in April of 1912 and walk up a gangway onto the most famous ship that ever sailed, the great floating palace they called Unsinkable, the RMS Titanic. A world of marble and gold and chandeliers, of grand staircases and orchestras, and the richest people on earth wrapped in furs and diamonds, gliding across the Atlantic in a luxury the world had never seen. And tonight, you become one of them, a first-class lady, sweeping up the gangway into the most glamorous 5 days a human being could buy. The truth about the gilded life aboard the Titanic: it was more beautiful and more strange than you can imagine, and you very likely wouldn't last a day. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure here ever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered across the world, settling in under the blankets together, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights. Sink into your pillows. Let your shoulders grow heavy. And let's step back together to that April morning at the docks in Southampton, where the largest moving object ever built by human hands is waiting at the quay, and a whole gilded world is about to come aboard. Congratulations. You are about to sail on the Titanic. The good news: you are rich, you are fashionable, and you are about to spend 5 days inside the most luxurious machine ever built, weighted upon hand and foot, dining like royalty, crossing the ocean in a comfort that the kings of a century before could never have dreamed of. The bad news: on this particular voyage, history has rather spoiled in advance, but you do not know that yet, and tonight neither shall we dwell on it. Tonight we are simply going to live, slowly and luxuriously, inside the most glamorous days the Edwardian world had to offer. So let us not begin in shadow. The morning is bright, the ship is waiting, and you have a great deal of being magnificent to do. You arrive at the docks at Southampton on the morning of the 10th of April, and the first thing that happens is that the Titanic takes your breath clean away. She is simply enormous. 880 feet of black steel hull and gleaming white superstructure, for great buff and black funnels towering against the sky, so vast that she does not seem like a ship at all, but like a building that has somehow wandered down to the sea. Crowds throng the quay, gulls wheel and cry, steam hisses, the band of voices and machinery rises all around you. And you, in your fine traveling costume, your maid and your mountain of trunks following behind, walk up the first-class gangway and step aboard the ship that the whole world has been talking about, the new wonder of the age, the largest and most luxurious liner ever to put to sea, and, everyone assures you with perfect confidence, the safest. The sailing of the Titanic was a great public event, reported in the newspapers of the world, photographed, marveled over. The maiden voyage of the largest ship ever built drew sightseers to the docks and headlines across 2 continents, and to be among her first-class passengers was to be, for those few days, an object of widespread envy, one of the fortunate few aboard the wonder of the age. You are not embarking on a mere crossing. You are stepping into the future, and into a floating palace, and you can feel, as your foot touches the deck, that this is going to be a voyage you will remember for the rest of your life. And then comes the moment of departure, which is itself a kind of theater. At noon the great whistles sound, so deep and so loud that you feel them in your chest, and the lines are cast off, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the largest ship in the world begins to move away from the quay. The crowds on the dock wave their hats and handkerchiefs. The passengers crowd the rails to wave back. There is a band, and cheering, and the strange swelling feeling of a great adventure beginning. And there is, on this particular sailing, a small and curious omen that you may or may not notice from your place at the rail. As the Titanic moves down the river, the tremendous suction of her passage snaps the mooring ropes of a smaller liner tied up nearby, dragging its stern out toward the passing giant, so that for a few breathless moments the two ships drift toward a collision before the tugs and the quick action of the crew pull them apart. It is nothing, a near miss, smoothed over in minutes, and the great voyage proceeds. But those of a superstitious turn will remember it later, the way the new ship seemed almost to reach out and seize another even as she left her berth. For now, though, it is simply a moment of drama on a day already full of them, and you turn your face to the open sea ahead, and the land slides away behind, and you are launched at last upon the crossing of your life. A steward in spotless white gloves greets you by name, and leads you through to your accommodation, and here the wonder only deepens, for the first-class staterooms of the Titanic are nothing like the cramped cabins of ordinary ships. They are bedrooms, proper, beautiful bedrooms, paneled in fine woods, hung with rich fabrics, furnished with real beds and writing desks and wardrobes and electric lamps with silk shades, decorated in whatever historical style the White Star Line's designers fancied. Here a room in the manner of Louis XVI, there one done up like a Georgian drawing-room, another in Italian Renaissance or Old Dutch. The very grandest passengers travel in the parlor suites, with their own private promenade decks, their own sitting rooms, their own servants' quarters, apartments grander than many a fine house ashore, floating out across the open ocean. Your own rooms are a marvel of comfort and taste. There is a bell to summon a steward at any hour, hot and cold running water, the soft hum of the great ship around you. You stand in the middle of it, drawing off your gloves, and you can hardly quite believe that all of this hushed, paneled, perfumed luxury, is going to be your home upon the water for the next 5 days. And you do not, of course, manage any of it yourself, for you have brought your lady's maid, and it is she who now sets about the long work of unpacking. For a first-class lady did not travel light. She traveled with trunks, great wardrobe trunks that stood on end and open like cupboards, packed with the staggering number of costumes a lady of fashion required to get through even a 5-day crossing. There were morning dresses, and walking costumes, and afternoon gowns, and tea gowns, and the grand dinner gowns for the evening, each with its own gloves and shoes and stockings and wrap. There were the furs, the jewels, the hats, the whole glittering apparatus of an Edwardian lady at the very height of fashion. Your maid unpacks and presses and hangs it all, lays out your things, draws your bath, dresses your hair, and will attend you faithfully through every changing hour of the voyage, for you will change your clothes several times a day, and you could no more manage the lacing and pinning and arranging of it alone than you could navigate the ship. She sleeps in humbler quarters and eats apart, and she is, though you may scarcely think about it, as essential to your glamorous progress across the Atlantic as the engines themselves. And the wardrobe she tends is a wonder in itself, a whole traveling collection of an Edwardian lady's armor, each piece for its proper hour and occasion. There are the tailored costumes for the morning, sober and elegant, the lighter, prettier frocks for luncheon, the soft, flowing tea gowns, the one daytime garment a lady might wear a little loosened, almost informal, for the intimate hour of afternoon tea, and then the magnificent evening gowns, the true glories of the trunk, of silk and satin and chiffon, beaded and embroidered and trimmed with lace, each meant to make its wearer a vision under the electric lights. With each go the accessories, the matching shoes and gloves and fans and wraps, the hats for the deck, the furs against the cold, the jewels for the evening, a whole apparatus of fashion that turned the simple act of getting through a day into a series of careful transformations. To dress well, to be seen in the right thing at the right hour, was both a pleasure and a duty, a lady's contribution to the great floating pageant, and it was all made possible by the patient, invisible labor of the maid who unpacked and pressed and mended and laced, the quiet partner in every dazzling appearance you made. That first day, the voyage was not yet truly the open sea crossing, for the Titanic had 2 more calls to make before she turned her bows to the Atlantic. In the evening she crossed to Cherbourg, on the coast of France, anchoring offshore, while little tender boats ferried out more passengers, among them some of the grandest of all, wealthy Americans returning home from their European travels, who came aboard by tender in the gathering dusk to join the great ship. And the next day she called at Queenstown, on the green southern coast of Ireland, where again the tenders came out, this time carrying many immigrants for the third-class decks, Irish men and women leaving their homeland for America with their whole lives packed into a bundle, and their hearts full of hope and grief. From the first-class deck you might have watched them come aboard far below, the last passengers to join the voyage, and watch the green hills of Ireland, the last land any of them would see for days, and for some the last land they would ever see, slip slowly away astern as the Titanic at last turned westward and stood out into the open ocean, gathering speed, bound now for New York across 3,000 miles of empty water. From that moment the voyage proper began, and the great ship settled into the long Atlantic rhythm that would fill the days ahead. When you are settled, you go out to explore, and the heart of the first-class world, the great showpiece that every passenger remembers, is the grand staircase. Picture it, a sweeping double staircase of polished oak, descending through several decks beneath an enormous wrought iron and glass dome that pours soft daylight down from above, gilded balustrades, carved cherubs, an ornate clock set into the paneling at the landing, flanked by allegorical figures representing honor and glory crowning time. To descend that staircase in the evening, in your finest gown, with the light glowing down through the dome, and the orchestra playing somewhere nearby, was to feel yourself the heroine of some great and glittering drama, and that, of course, was exactly the point. The whole ship was designed to make its first-class passengers feel like the most important people in the world, and nowhere did it succeed so completely as on those magnificent stairs. You rest your gloved hand on the gleaming rail, and you begin to descend, and for a moment the whole beautiful machine seems to have been built for no other purpose than to frame you as you go down. And the staircase was only the crown of it, for the public rooms of the first-class Titanic were a parade of beautiful interiors, each done in its own historical style by the finest craftsmen, so that to wander them was like walking through a great country house or a grand hotel ashore, the lounge in the manner of a French palace, all carved and gilded paneling, the reading and writing room in restful white, the smoking room rich with mahogany and stained glass, the reception room at the foot of the staircase where passengers gathered before dinner beneath a great tapestry. There were fresh flowers, and deep carpets, and softly shaded electric lamps, and everywhere the gleam of polished wood and the hush of luxury. It was difficult to believe, moving through these gracious rooms, that you were aboard a ship at all, far out upon the heaving Atlantic. The designers had labored precisely so that you should forget the sea, and feel yourself instead in the most elegant hotel in the world, one that happened, almost incidentally, to be carrying you across an ocean. Your days begin gently aboard the great ship. You wake in your warm and beautiful stateroom to the soft gray light at the porthole or the windows, the faint steady throb of the engines having rocked you through the night. And for a moment you must remind yourself where you are, that you are not in your own bed at home, but far out upon the Atlantic, in the most famous ship in the world, with nothing before you all day but pleasure and comfort. Your maid comes. A steward might bring early tea. The bath is drawn. There is no rush, no duty, no care to trouble the morning, only the slow, luxurious business of rising and being made beautiful, and going out to greet another perfect day at sea. It is a kind of waking that most people in the world will never know. To open your eyes inside a floating palace, cradled in warmth and safety, with an army of servants ready to attend your smallest wish, and a whole day of idle splendor stretching ahead. You lie a moment in the soft linen, listening to the great ship breathe around you, and then you rise to meet the gilded hours. But before you can do any sweeping descent, there is the matter of getting dressed, and aboard the Titanic, as everywhere in your world, that is no small undertaking. Edwardian fashion has softened a little from the rigid Victorian shapes. The silhouette is long and slender now, the great leg of mutton sleeves and wasp waists giving way to a more flowing line, but you are still laced into a long corset that shapes you from bust to hip, still layered in chemise and corset cover and petticoats beneath your gown, still pinned and hooked and fastened into an outfit it would be quite impossible to put on without help. And you do this not once, but several times a day, for the rules of dress aboard ship are as exacting as in any great house ashore. A costume for the morning, a different one for luncheon, another for the afternoon, and above all the grand toilette for dinner. Each change is a small production, your maid lacing and arranging while you stand patient before the mirror, and by the time you are finally ready you are a vision of Edwardian elegance, and you have spent, all told, a remarkable portion of your day simply being assembled and reassembled into the various costumes the hours require. When at last you are dressed for the day, you make your way to breakfast in the first-class dining saloon, and it is a room to take the breath away. It is the largest room on any ship afloat, stretching the full width of the vessel, done in a graceful white Jacobean style, lit by leaded windows of colored glass designed to suggest that you are dining in some great country house rather than on the open sea. Here the first-class passengers gather at tables dressed in crisp white linen and gleaming silver and crystal, attended by an army of stewards, to begin the day with a breakfast of truly Edwardian abundance. Porridge and eggs and bacon, grilled kidneys and fish, cold meats, fresh fruit, breads and rolls and marmalade, pots of tea and coffee, a spread fit for the grandest hotel, served with the same flawless ceremony, hundreds of feet above the floor of the Atlantic. You take your place, the morning light slanting through the colored glass, the soft murmur of well-bred conversation all around you, and you are waited upon as though the ship existed solely to feed and please you, which, in first class, it very nearly did. The stewards know already how you take your tea. Your napkin is unfolded for you, your chair drawn. Whatever you desire appears as if by magic, and whatever you do not is silently cleared away. There is a leisureliness to it all, an unhurried grace, that is itself a luxury, for you are not snatching a meal before some pressing duty, as ordinary people must. You have nowhere to be and nothing to do but enjoy, slowly, the abundance set before you, and to look out, between courses, at the great gray ocean rolling past beyond the leaded glass, and marvel that you can sit in such warmth and comfort and plenty in the very middle of it. After breakfast, you go up for a turn about the decks, for promenading is one of the great pleasures and great rituals of shipboard life. The first-class passengers have the run of the upper decks, the broad promenade where you may stroll in the bracing sea air, wrapped against the cold in your furs, nodding to acquaintances, taking the exercise that the doctors recommend and the etiquette requires. There are sheltered enclosed promenades for when the wind is sharp, and deck chairs where you may sit, tucked under a rug by an attentive steward, with a book or simply the great gray heave of the ocean to watch. To walk the deck of the Titanic on a clear cold April morning, the sea stretching empty to the horizon, the great ship throbbing gently beneath your feet, the salt wind in your face, it is one of the simplest and most genuine pleasures of the whole voyage, and one of the few moments when even a first-class lady might feel, for a little while, gloriously free. And there is a particular contentment in settling into a deck chair, wrapped warm in a steamer rug brought by an attentive steward, with a cup of hot bouillon perhaps, and a book in your lap, and simply watching the ocean go by, the long slow heave of the gray-green swell, the white wake stretching back toward the horizon, the occasional distant smudge of another ship's smoke, the great empty dome of the sky. The hours pass dreamily so. You read a little, doze a little, exchange a word with a passing acquaintance, watch the sea. There is nowhere to go, and nothing you must do. The ship carries you. The world turns slowly past, and time itself seems to soften and slow. As the days went on, the air grew colder, and the deck chairs thinned, the passengers driven inside to the warm lounges by the increasing chill. But on the milder days, to lie out on deck in the sea air, idle and warm and watched over, was one of the gentlest pleasures the voyage had to give, and a memory the survivors would carry of those last bright days before the cold came down in earnest. There were diversions on deck, too, for those who wanted them, games of quoits and shuffleboard, and the gentle competitive amusements of shipboard life, the younger passengers laughing over them in the sea air while their elders watched from the deck chairs. Children played their own games along the sheltered stretches. Couples strolled arm in arm, and the long afternoons passed in a pleasant blur of small pleasures, the whole first-class world taking its ease in the bracing cold, the great ship carrying them all westward beneath the wide pale sky. It was the simplest sort of happiness, and the most ordinary, and that, perhaps, is part of what makes it linger so, that the last days aboard the Titanic were, for those who lived them, not dramatic at all, but gentle and pleasant, and entirely without shadow. And the days fell into a gentle, pleasant rhythm all their own, the kind of unhurried rhythm that only a voyage can give. There was a luxurious sense of time suspended, of the ordinary cares of life left behind on the receding shore. No household to run, no calls to pay, no duties, but to be comfortable and charming and amused. The mornings drifted by in promenading and reading and conversation. The long lunches gave way to lazy afternoons of tea and music and deck chairs. The evenings rose to their glittering climax at dinner, and then softened into music and cards and early, well-fed sleep. You fell in, within a day, with the easy society of your fellow first-class passengers, the same faces appearing at meals and on deck, acquaintances ripening quickly into the temporary intimacy of shipboard friendship, for there is something about a voyage that draws strangers together, the shared adventure of it, the sense of being a little world unto yourselves, cut off from everywhere, gliding together across the empty sea. You exchanged calls and confidences, compared notes on mutual friends ashore, traded the gossip of two continents' high society, and made plans to meet again in New York. The talk was of marriages and scandals and fortunes, of who was aboard and who was not, of the wonders of the ship and the pleasures awaiting in America, the light, agreeable, endless conversation of the leisured rich, flowing on through the gilded hours. And there was, threaded through it all, a particular glamour to knowing that you were aboard the maiden voyage of the Titanic herself, the very first crossing of the most famous ship in the world, an event the newspapers of 2 continents had trumpeted for months. To be a first-class passenger on that maiden voyage was to be part of something historic, something everyone ashore envied. You were among the chosen few aboard the wonder of the age on her triumphant first run, and there was a pride and an excitement in it that colored the whole voyage, a sense of being at the very center of the modern world. Little did any of that brilliant company dream that the maiden voyage would indeed be remembered forever, though not at all for the reasons they supposed, that they were not making history in the way they imagined, gliding along so confidently through those golden April days. But that is a knowledge we keep to ourselves tonight. In their world, in your world, it is simply the proudest and most delightful crossing imaginable, and every day aboard is a day to treasure. And when you tire of the air, the ship offers wonders that no vessel had ever offered before, for the Titanic was fitted out almost like a great floating resort. There is a gymnasium up on the boat deck, gleaming with the latest apparatus, mechanical horses and camels to ride, rowing machines, an electric exercise cycle, overseen by an instructor in white flannels, who would cheerfully demonstrate the contraptions to curious passengers and encourage the ladies to take a little healthful exercise. One could ride a mechanical camel and gaze out through the great windows at the endless sea, a faintly comical and entirely delightful novelty. There is, astonishingly, a swimming pool deep in the ship, one of the first ever put to sea, its water warm and inviting. There are Turkish baths done up in gorgeous Moorish style, with gilded tiles, and cooling rooms where you might recline on a couch after the heat. There are squash courts, a barber, a dark room for the photographers among the passengers. It is difficult, lying in a deck chair gazing at the empty ocean, quite to grasp that beneath you, inside this single ship, lies a whole town of pleasures, and that all of it is moving, steadily and smoothly, across 3,000 miles of open sea. And for a woman of your class, there was a particular sweetness in it, for the rules that hemmed a lady's life ashore were loosened just a little here. At home your days were a careful round of calls and duties, and the management of a household, your conduct watched and weighed at every turn. Aboard ship, suspended between 2 worlds, there was a holiday freedom in the air, fewer obligations, gentler hours, the pleasant company of strangers, the great open sea instead of the watching town. It was still a gilded enclosure, of course, still bounded by all the etiquette of your station, but it was, for 5 days, a softer and a brighter one, and a lady might breathe a little more freely upon the deck of the Titanic than she ever quite could in her own drawing-room at home. Imagine spending a quiet hour in the Turkish baths, deep in the warm heart of the ship, passing through the heated rooms with their glowing tiles of blue and green and gold, the air thick and warm and scented, and then reclining at last upon a couch in the cooling room, a gorgeous chamber done in an exotic Eastern style, with carved woodwork and hanging lamps and low divans, sipping something cool, utterly relaxed, while somewhere far away the Atlantic heaves cold and gray against the hull. You cannot feel, or imagine descending to the swimming bath, that astonishing novelty, and slipping into the warm sea-water to bathe far below the waterline, the gentle motion of the ship rocking the surface of the pool, These were pleasures no ocean traveler in all of history had ever known until almost yesterday, and aboard the Titanic you might enjoy them as casually as a stroll, your every comfort tended by attendants, the marvels of the modern world arranged for your idle delight in the middle of the deep sea. A lady might fill her days entirely with such soft luxuries: the bath, the deck chair, the tea, the music, the long lazy hours of being perfectly comfortable, and feel, with some justice, that no one in the whole long history of the world had ever been quite so pampered as she was, just now, aboard this floating wonder. And to move about this floating city was itself a wonder, for the Titanic was fitted with that thrilling novelty of the modern age, the electric elevator, several of them, gleaming cages with uniformed attendants, to carry the first-class passengers smoothly between the decks so that a lady need not so much as climb a stair if she did not wish to. Think how marvelous that was, in 1912, to step into a little lift aboard a ship in the middle of the ocean, and be carried gently up to the boat deck as though you were in a grand hotel on dry land. Everywhere you turned there was some new triumph of comfort and invention, the electric light blazing in every room, the heating that kept the cold sea at bay, the telephones, the bells, the hot water gushing from the taps, the whole apparatus of modern luxury transplanted whole onto the deep. For the passengers, much of the joy of the voyage lay in exactly this: the giddy sense of living at the very forefront of the age, aboard the newest and cleverest thing humanity had ever made, in a comfort their own grandparents could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. The Titanic was not just a way to cross the ocean. She was a showcase of everything the modern world believed it had achieved, a floating monument to progress itself. There are quieter pleasures, too, for the hours between the great meals. There is a first-class lounge and a reading and writing room, an elegant, restful chamber done in white and rose, with deep chairs and a fine library of books, and writing desks furnished with the ship's own crested stationery, where you might pass a peaceful hour with a novel, or write letters home to be posted the moment you reach New York, describing every marvel of the voyage to friends who will scarcely believe you. There is a veranda cafe, the Café Parisien, made to look like a charming French sidewalk cafe, with ivy trained up its trellised walls, and wicker chairs, and great windows on the sea, much favored by the younger set as a bright and informal place to take coffee. And the writing room itself was a quiet pleasure not to be hurried past. To sit at one of its desks, with a sheet of the ship's own crested paper before you and a good pen in your hand, and write a long letter home, telling of the wonders of the great liner, the marble, and the music, and the 11-course dinners, the famous people glimpsed at the next table, the sheer impossible luxury of it all, was a delight in itself, the more so because the letter would be carried ashore and posted from New York, reaching your friends with the glamorous postmark of the maiden voyage. Many such letters were written aboard those few days. A number survive, and there is a piercing poignancy in reading them now, these cheerful ordinary notes full of delight, and small complaints and plans for arrival, written by people gliding happily through the last bright days, with no notion in the world of what lay ahead. There is even, remarkably, shopping of a kind, and a barber's shop selling little souvenirs and trinkets of the great ship. The whole vessel is arranged so that a first-class passenger need never be bored, never be uncomfortable, never want for anything at all, so that the 5 days of the crossing might pass not as a tiresome voyage to be endured but as a delightful interlude, a floating holiday at the finest hotel imaginable, with the bonus of the boundless sea outside every window. And high above all this, in a small bright cabin near the top of the ship, sits one of the great wonders of the age, the very newest magic of the modern world, the wireless room, where the Marconi operators sit at their crackling apparatus tapping out messages in Morse code across hundreds of miles of empty air. This is a thrilling novelty, and the first-class passengers make eager use of it, sending wireless messages, Marconigrams, to friends and business partners ashore and on other ships, a marvel that would have seemed pure sorcery to their grandparents. Words flung invisibly across the ocean, faster than any ship could carry them. The operators are kept busy day and night with the passengers' cheerful chatter, their greetings and their stock orders, and their boasts of the splendid crossing. And it is across this same wireless, threaded in among all the trivial traffic, that the warnings of ice will come, message after message from other ships, of bergs and field ice in the waters ahead, passed along, noted, and, amid the press of passenger messages and the general confidence of the age, not acted upon as, with hindsight, they so terribly should have been. The ship is full, too, of children and families, for the first-class passenger list was not all dowagers and tycoons. There were young couples, and parents with their children and the children's nurses, and the little ones lent the gilded decks a sweetness all their own, small boys in sailor suits spinning tops on the promenade, little girls with their dolls, nursemaids wheeling babies along the sheltered deck. The children allowed their own early meals and their own games while their parents dressed for the grand adult evening. And there was a whole rhythm to the day beyond the meals and the dressing. The great event each noon when the ship's run was posted, the number of miles she had made in the past 24 hours, over which the gentlemen ran a friendly betting pool, wagering on whether she would beat the previous day's distance, all of them eager to see the magnificent new ship show her paces, and perhaps make a fast crossing. The Titanic was not trying to break records, whatever the legends later said, but there was pride in her speed all the same, and pleasure in watching the daily total climb, and the passengers followed it like a sport. Now, it would be easy, drifting through all this splendor, to forget that the Titanic carried not one world but three, rigidly separated and barely aware of one another. For below your gilded decks lay second class, comfortable, respectable, by the standards of the day really very fine, and below that, third class, or steerage, where hundreds upon hundreds of immigrants traveled in the cheapest accommodation, dreaming of new lives in America, in plain clean cabins and shared spaces far down in the hull. And the people in those lower decks were on the most important journey of their lives. The third-class passengers of the Titanic were, in great part, immigrants, men and women and whole families leaving the old countries of Europe, leaving Ireland and Scandinavia and the Levant and a dozen other lands, carrying everything they owned in a trunk or a bundle, bound for America and the new life they had dreamed of, and saved for and dared everything to reach. For them, the great ship was not a floating palace of leisure, but a bridge to the future, the vessel that would carry them across the ocean to the country where, they believed, a poor person might yet become anything at all. Their accommodation, though plain, was by the standards of immigrant travel really very decent, clean and comfortable, and far better than the wretched steerage of older ships. And below decks they made their own world for the crossing, with their own dining rooms and gathering spaces, their music and dancing in the evenings, the hopeful hum of 100 different tongues. The three classes were kept strictly apart, by custom and by actual barriers, and as a first-class lady you would, in all likelihood, pass the entire voyage without ever once setting eyes on the people traveling in the decks below your feet. You inhabited the top of the ship and the top of the world, in a bright bubble of luxury, while beneath you, unseen, traveled a whole cross-section of humanity whose voyage was a very different thing from your own. It is worth remembering, as we wander your gilded rooms tonight, that the Titanic was not only a palace. It was, in miniature, the whole steep pyramid of the age, floating out together across the same dark water. And what a company it was, that first-class passenger list, for the Titanic on her maiden voyage carried what was very nearly a roll call of the wealth and fame of 2 continents, and to move among them was to brush shoulders with some of the most celebrated people of the age. There were millionaires whose fortunes were the stuff of legend. There were famous names of business and society and the arts. There were titled English aristocrats and American tycoons and the glittering wives and daughters who orbited them. Everyone, it seemed, who as anyone had wanted to be aboard the maiden voyage of the wonder of the age. And so the ship became, for those 5 days, a kind of floating who's who, a concentration of riches and renown such as rarely gathered in one place. As a first-class lady you would dine among them, and promenade among them, and take your tea among them, forever aware of the delicate gradations of rank and fortune even within that exalted company, for first class had its own subtle hierarchy, its old money and its new, its truly grand and its merely rich, and a lady learned to read it as surely as she read anything else. To be accepted there, to be invited to the right tables and greeted by the right people, was its own quiet competition, played out in a gilded world that took itself, and its distinctions, entirely seriously. And there was a real pleasure, for a lady of that world, simply in the watching of it, in noting who had come aboard and who was traveling with whom, in recognizing a famous face across the dining saloon, in trading whispered intelligence over tea about the fortunes and marriages and scandals of the great names all around. The voyage was, among everything else, a glorious opportunity for the most refined sort of gossip. The whole brilliant company gathered in one place for 5 days with nothing to do but observe and be observed. You learned, within a day, which of your fellow passengers were the truly grand ones, which the merely rich, which the interesting, which the dull. You exchanged knowing glances and discreet remarks with your particular friends. You stored away the small dramas of the dining saloon to retell, with relish, in the drawing rooms of New York. It was harmless, and it was delicious, and it was one of the oldest pleasures of her kind. And aboard the Titanic, with so dazzling a cast assembled, it had never been more delicious in all her life. And there was a particular pleasure, too, in the slow, dreamlike sameness of the days, the way the voyage settled into its own gentle rhythm, and the outside world fell away entirely. After the first day's excitement of exploring the ship, the crossing became a kind of floating idyll, each day much like the last and none the worse for it. The leisurely waking, the long breakfast, the morning on deck, the luncheon, the afternoon of tea and music and dozing, the great ritual of dinner, the quiet musical evening, the early contented sleep. There were no newspapers, but the little ship's bulletin, no telephone calls, no callers, no errands, no duties at all. You were sealed off, for these few days, in a bright warm bubble adrift on the sea, with nothing to do but be comfortable and amused. For a woman whose life ashore was a ceaseless round of obligation, that suspension of all care was perhaps the rarest luxury of the whole voyage, the gift of empty, golden, unhurried time, with the whole gray Atlantic standing between you and everything you were meant to worry about. Presiding over the whole floating kingdom was the captain, Edward Smith, the White Star Line's most senior and most trusted commander, a calm, white-bearded, much-admired old sea dog, the very picture of a reassuring ship's master, who was said to be making this maiden voyage of the great new liner the crowning trip of his long career before retirement. The passengers held him in great esteem. To be invited to dine at the captain's table was a coveted honor, eagerly sought among the first-class passengers, a public mark of one's standing in the floating society, and his steady presence on the bridge was part of the deep sense of security that wrapped the whole ship. There was a whole gentle politics to the dining arrangements, indeed, a careful sorting of who sat where and with whom. The prominent and the well-connected gathered near the captain and the prize tables, the rest ranged by an unspoken hierarchy that everyone understood, and to climb, over the course of the voyage, into the right circles, to be taken up by the truly grand and invited to the best little dinners and card parties, was the quiet game that the ambitious among the first class passengers played all the way across the sea. For even in that exalted company there were heights and depths, and a clever woman watched and learned and placed herself, with all the skill she would have used in a London season, exactly where she most wished to be seen. Beneath him served a crew of hundreds, officers, sailors, engineers far below tending the great roaring furnaces, stewards and cooks and stokers, and the whole vast invisible workforce that kept the palace gleaming and the passengers content. You saw only the polished surface of it, the white-gloved stewards and the smiling deck attendants, the immense labor underneath, the men shoveling coal in the heat of the boiler rooms deep below the waterline, remained as hidden from you as the people of steerage. The ship ran, to first-class eyes, as if by magic, and magic, of a kind made of coal and sweat and discipline, was exactly what it was. For deep in the belly of the great vessel, far below the gilded decks where you took your tea, lay another world entirely, the vast engine and boiler rooms, where scores of men labored in heat and noise and coal dust to feed the enormous furnaces that drove the ship, shoveling coal hour after hour into the roaring fires that turned the water to steam, that turned the mighty engines, that turned the great propellers far astern. It was brutal, exhausting, dangerous work, performed in conditions you could scarcely have imagined from your deck chair, and it was this hidden army of stokers and trimmers and engineers, sweating in the depths, who actually carried you across the sea. The faint, steady throb you felt beneath your feet, the gentle tremor that rocked you to sleep, was the heartbeat of all that unseen labor. The Titanic was, in truth, two ships at once, the bright floating palace above, and the roaring industrial engine below, the one resting wholly upon the other, the luxury of the few borne up by the toil of the many, a perfect image, if you cared to see it, of the whole age that built her. The voyage had its gentler rhythms, too, that bound the days together. On Sunday morning there was a divine service, held in the first-class dining saloon, the captain himself leading the passengers in the familiar hymns and prayers, and it is one of the small, haunting details of the story that among the hymns sung that last Sunday were the old seafarers' verses that asked God's protection for those in peril on the sea. The passengers sang them as a comfortable ritual, never dreaming how soon the words would be put to the test. And all the while, across those April days, the weather held fair and the sea stayed calm, but the air grew steadily, bitterly colder as the ship drove north and west into the latitudes where the ice came down, so that the open decks emptied a little, and the passengers wrapped themselves more deeply in their furs, and remarked to one another how sharp the cold had turned, without ever quite asking themselves why. The sea, on that last day, was flat and black and utterly still, with no wind to raise a wave, beautiful and strange, and, though no one yet knew it, the worst possible conditions for spotting ice upon the water. In the afternoon comes one of the loveliest rituals of the day, tea. In the elegant reception rooms, or the palm court with its wicker chairs and trellis greenery and tall windows looking out on the sea, the first-class ladies gather in their afternoon gowns to take tea as it was taken in the finest drawing-rooms ashore. Delicate sandwiches and little cakes and scones, poured from silver pots into fine china, while a small orchestra plays softly in the background. For the Titanic carried its own band, accomplished musicians who played throughout the day in the lounges and at tea and after dinner, filling the great rooms with light, pleasant music, waltzes and ragtime and selections from the popular operettas that drifted through the gilded spaces and made the whole voyage feel like one long, gracious party. You sit among the potted palms with your tea and your conversation, the music playing, the soft April light on the water beyond the windows, and you feel that you have wandered into the most civilized place on earth. The ship's musicians were accomplished professionals, and their playing was one of the quiet glories of the voyage. Like classical pieces and waltzes, the popular songs and ragtime tunes of the day, selections from the operettas everyone knew, drifting through the lounges and the reception rooms and the a la carte restaurant, lending the whole first-class world a gentle, continuous soundtrack of gracious pleasure. To take your tea or your coffee with that music in the air, the sea sliding past beyond the windows, the soft hum of cultivated conversation all around, was to feel that life had been arranged for your delight down to its smallest detail. We remember those musicians now for the courage of their final hours, for the legend that they played on as the ship went down. But for most of the voyage they were simply part of the seamless luxury, filling the gilded rooms with sweetness, asking nothing of you but that you sit and listen and be content. As the day fades toward evening, the whole first-class world withdraws to dress. And now comes the grandest ritual of all, the long and serious business of dressing for dinner. This is the summit of a lady's day, the occasion for which the most magnificent of all your gowns has been brought, and your maid devotes herself to it utterly. The elaborate evening dress of silk and chiffon and beadwork, the long gloves, the dressing of the hair, and then the jewels, the diamonds and pearls and emeralds that the first-class passengers carried with them, real fortunes in gems worn glittering to dinner upon the open sea. It is a long ritual, and a serious one, undertaken with the gravity that the occasion demands. Your hair is dressed and pinned into the soft full style of the day, perhaps adorned with an aigrette or a jeweled comb. Your face is attended to. You are laced and fastened into the gown, the train arranged, the gloves drawn up past the elbow, and then, last of all, the jewels are brought from the safe and clasped at your throat and your wrists and your ears, the final touch that completes the transformation. You stand before the long mirror as your maid makes her last adjustments, and you watch yourself become, by slow degrees, the most splendid version of yourself the age can produce, and then you draw a breath, and gather your wrap, and go out to make your entrance into the most glittering evening on the ocean. To dine in first class aboard the Titanic was to take part in a nightly parade of wealth and fashion as dazzling as anything in London or New York. The descent of the grand staircase before dinner was a procession of the gowned and bejeweled, the cream of two continents society on display. And the jewels were extraordinary, for the first-class passengers carried with them, in their cabin safes and about their throats, real fortunes in precious stones, diamonds and pearls and emeralds and sapphires worn casually to dinner as though it were nothing at all. A lady's gems were part of her armor and her advertisement, a glittering announcement of her family's standing. And on the great ship they came out each evening in a display of concentrated wealth such as few rooms on earth could match. Necklaces and tiaras and rings flashing in the soft electric light, a king's ransom strolling between the tables. Some of those jewels went down with the ship and lie still in the dark on the ocean floor. Some came up in the lifeboats, clutched in the hands of fleeing women. But on those first bright evenings they simply sparkled, worn without a care, part of the nightly spectacle of the richest company ever to cross the Atlantic. You stand before the mirror as your maid fastens the last clasp at your throat, and the woman who looks back at you is as splendid as any duchess, and you go out to take your place in the most glittering dinner the ocean has ever seen. And what a dinner it is! In the great dining saloon, or for the very grandest in the exclusive a la carte restaurant, the famous Ritz, a separate, even finer establishment where passengers could dine at their own hours in surroundings of the utmost elegance. The first-class passengers sit down to a meal of staggering refinement, course after course, 10 or 11 of them, oysters and consommé and poached salmon, filet mignon and roast duckling and lamb, pâté de foie gras, cold asparagus, elaborate sweets and ices, and a final array of fruits and cheeses, each course matched with its proper wine, all served with the flawless ceremony of a great hotel by stewards, who anticipated your every wish. The conversation was of society and travel and the marvels of the ship. The orchestra played. The jewels glittered in the electric light, and through it all the Titanic moved smoothly westward, the engines a distant murmur, the dark Atlantic sliding past unseen beyond the warm and brilliant rooms. There was a particular gaiety to those dinners, a sense of occasion that never quite faded across the voyage, for everyone aboard felt the thrill of the maiden voyage, the pleasure of seeing and being seen among such a brilliant company, the delight of so much beauty and abundance gathered in one glowing room far out upon the sea. New acquaintances were made between the courses, old friends discovered across the saloon, plans laid for meeting again in New York, toasts raised to the wonderful ship and the splendid crossing. It was society at its most charming and most confident, the cream of two nations dining in perfect contentment, with not the faintest shadow upon the evening, only the soft music, and the candlelight on the silver, and the pleasant certainty that tomorrow would bring another day exactly as lovely as this one. And behind that effortless perfection lay a small army of labor, and a marvel of organization. The kitchens of the Titanic were vast, gleaming establishments staffed by scores of cooks and bakers and confectioners and butchers, presided over by chefs of real distinction. The a la carte restaurant, the Ritz, was run almost as an independent luxury establishment with its own celebrated staff, where for an extra cost the grandest passengers might dine at fashionable hours on dishes to rival the finest restaurants of Paris or London. The provisioning of the ship for her crossing was a feat in itself. Tens of thousands of pieces of china and crystal and silver, tons of fresh meat and fish and poultry, mountains of fruit and vegetables and flour and sugar, oceans of wine and spirits, all stowed and managed so that for 5 days some 2,000 souls might be fed, and the few hundred in first class fed like royalty. Far out upon the open sea where not so much as a fresh egg could be had for love nor money. Every gleaming course set before you was the visible tip of an immense, hidden machinery of supply and skill and service, all of it arranged so that you might simply sit and be charmed, and never once think about how the miracle was wrought. It is, you think, the most beautiful meal you have ever eaten. in the most beautiful room you have ever seen, and it is hard, in all that golden warmth, to remember that there is anything beyond these walls at all. After dinner the company drifts apart along the old familiar lines. The gentlemen withdraw to the smoking room, a handsome, clubby chamber of dark paneling and stained glass and deep leather chairs, the masculine heart of the ship, where they take their brandy and cigars and talk of business and politics and play at cards. The ladies retire to the lounge, a gorgeous room done in the style of a French palace, all carved paneling and rich carpet and softly shaded lamps, to take coffee and talk and listen to the orchestra. There is music, there are quiet hands of bridge, there is the soft murmur of a contented society at the close of a perfect day. And gradually, as the hour grows late, the great rooms begin to empty, and the passengers make their way, by the glow of the electric lights, back through the paneled corridors to their staterooms, while the band plays its last tunes and the stewards move quietly through the emptying lounges, and the Unsinkable ship carries her sleeping passengers on through the dark. And what a thing it is to go to bed aboard the Titanic! Your maid helps you out of the great dinner gown and the corset and the jewels, unpins your hair, brings you whatever you need, and then you are alone at last in your beautiful stateroom, the lamp glowing softly, the bed turned down, the room warm against the bitter sea outside. You lie down in fine linen sheets, and you feel beneath you the faint, deep, steady tremor of the engines, far below, driving the ship on through the night. You hear, if you listen, the soft sounds of the great vessel, a distant murmur, the creak of her settling, the hush of the sea sliding past somewhere beyond the hull. There is no safer, more comfortable place in all the world, you think, than this, cradled in luxury, watched over by hundreds of attentive hands, borne smoothly across the ocean inside the strongest, finest, most modern ship ever built. And so you drift towards sleep, rocked gently by the deep, utterly at peace, certain to your very bones that nothing could possibly disturb the serene perfection of this floating palace and the soft warm dark of your beautiful room upon the sea. For that was the great gift of the first-class life aboard her, and the great difference from the ordinary travel of the age, not merely the splendor, but the deep, total, untroubled sense of safety. To cross the wild North Atlantic in April had always been, for all of history before this, a thing with a shiver of risk in it, the storms, the cold, the sheer indifferent immensity of the sea. But aboard the Titanic that shiver seemed at last to have been banished. Here was a ship so huge, so strong, so cleverly made, that the ocean itself appeared to have been tamed, reduced to a mere scenic backdrop for the comfort of her passengers. You could lie in your warm bed, and feel the great deep beneath you, and not fear it in the slightest, for surely, the men who had built this marvel had thought of everything. That serene and total confidence was perhaps the most luxurious thing the ship provided of all, more luxurious than the marble, or the chandeliers, or the 11-course dinners, and it is the one thing, of everything aboard her, that we cannot quite share tonight, knowing what we know. So let us borrow it from them, just for now, that perfect, peaceful certainty of safety, and carry it with us towards sleep. And through all these gilded days, you carry with you the same invisible rules that governed a lady's life ashore, for the ocean did not loosen them in the least. A respectable woman, even here, did not wander quite freely. A young unmarried lady traveled under the watchful eye of her mother or a chaperone, and the delicate etiquette of introductions and propriety held just as firmly among the deck chairs as in any London drawing-room. There was, beneath the pleasant surface, the same quiet machinery of the marriage market always turning, mothers assessing eligible young men across the dining saloon, matches contemplated, reputations guarded, for a voyage like this through the wealthy young of two continents together in delightful proximity, and more than one shipboard acquaintance was watched with a calculating maternal eye. You learned, as always, to be charming within bounds, friendly without forwardness, to know exactly who might properly be spoken to and who might not, and to conduct even your leisure aboard this floating paradise according to the same fine code that ruled you everywhere else. The Titanic was a holiday, but you were never quite off duty as a lady. The performance of gentility went on, gracefully, all the way across the sea. And as ever, your ease rested on the labor of others whom you scarcely saw. Your own maid, of course, dressed and tended you, but beyond her moved a whole hidden world of service that made the magic possible. The stewards, who learned your name and your preferences within a day, the stewardesses who turned down the beds and ran the baths, the waiters and the wine stewards, the cooks and confectioners in the great kitchens producing those 11-course dinners, the men in the gleaming pantries polishing the endless silver, and far below, in the heat and roaring coal dust of the boiler rooms, the stokers and trimmers shoveling the fuel that drove the whole palace forward. These people kept their own strict hierarchy, and their own quarters, and their own long hours, glimpsed by the first-class passenger only as a pair of white gloves offering a dish, or a quiet figure stepping aside in a corridor. The smoothness of your voyage, its seeming effortlessness, was the product of relentless, invisible work, and it is one of the quiet truths of that vanished world that the more perfectly you were served, the less you were ever meant to notice the serving. The men, meanwhile, had their own kingdom in the evenings, the smoking room, that handsome, clubby sanctum of dark mahogany and leather and stained glass, where the gentlemen retired after dinner to their cigars and brandy, and the long card games that ran late into the night. Here the talk was of markets and politics and the marvels of the age, and here, too, moved a shadowier sort of passenger that the great liners always attracted, the professional gamblers, the smooth and well-dressed card sharps who worked the transatlantic crossings, fleecing the wealthy and the foolish at cards, so practiced and so plausible that the line quietly warned its passengers against them. It was a world closed to you as a lady. You would have retired to the lounge with the other women, to coffee and music and quieter conversation, but it was part of the rich social tapestry of the ship, the masculine counterpart to the feminine evening, the whole company sorting itself after dinner along the ancient lines of sex and custom, as it did in every grand house from New York to London. For that was the word on everyone's lips, the comfortable certainty that lay beneath all the gaiety, that the Titanic was unsinkable. She was the last word in marine engineering, her hull divided into watertight compartments that could be sealed at the turn of a switch, so cleverly designed, it was said, that she could float with several of them flooded. The very idea that such a ship could founder seemed almost absurd, a thing of the credulous past. The passengers felt themselves, with good reason, to be aboard the safest vessel ever built. And so when the warnings came in over those April days, the messages from other ships passed along the wireless, of ice in the waters ahead, of a field of bergs drifting down across the great circle track, they stirred no real alarm. It is one of the strangest and most sorrowful truths of the whole story, this calm indifference to the gathering danger, that warning after warning was received and noted and somehow not truly heeded, lost in the comfortable confidence of the age. The wireless carried the messages. Some reached the bridge, some were set aside amid the press of passengers' cheerful traffic, and the great ship drove on westward at a fine speed into the very waters the warnings described, on a night so calm, and so clear, and so utterly without wind that the sea lay flat as black glass, which meant, though no one thought of it, that there would be no waves breaking white at the foot of any iceberg to betray its presence in the dark. The ship steamed on at a good speed through a calm and bitterly cold sea. The lookouts watched the dark water ahead, and the passengers, snug in their warm and brilliant rooms, gave the ice no thought at all. Why should they? They were aboard the unsinkable Titanic, the wonder of the age, and nothing in all the gleaming confidence allowed for the possibility that the sea, in the end, does not care how grand the ship, nor how certain the men who built her. And there was, for all the bustle and the society, a strange and lovely peace to be found aboard her, especially at night. Imagine stepping out, late, onto the boat deck after the warmth and brilliance of dinner, wrapped in your furs against the astonishing cold, into a darkness and a silence unlike anything ashore. The ship moves almost without sound, only the faint deep throb of the engines far below and the soft hiss of the sea sliding past the hull. Above you the sky is utterly clear and black and crowded with more stars than you have ever seen in your life, the whole glittering wheel of the heavens turning slowly overhead, with no city light anywhere in all the world to dim them. The sea is flat as a dark mirror, stretching away to a horizon you cannot see, and the great ship is a single island of warmth and light gliding across the vast cold emptiness of the Atlantic night. It is humbling, and it is beautiful, and it makes a person feel very small and very safe all at once, small against the immensity of the ocean and the stars, and safe inside the great strong miracle of the ship. You stand at the rail a while in the freezing dark, your breath clouding, the stars blazing down, and then you go back in to the warmth and the lamplight, and down the quiet corridors to your beautiful stateroom, and you sleep, rocked gently by the sea, as snug and as certain as it is possible for a human being to be. And there is, in that contrast, something almost unbearably tender to hold in the mind tonight, the tiny island of warmth and music and golden light, with all its sleeping passengers safe in their beds, gliding on across the vast cold indifferent dark of the ocean and the night. They did not know how fragile it was, that bright warm world. They felt it to be the strongest, safest thing ever made. And so they slept, all of them, the famous and the humble, the grand ladies and the immigrant children, rocked by the same gentle engines, dreaming their separate dreams, carried together through the starlit dark toward a morning that, for those first nights, always came. Let us hold them there, all of them, warm and dreaming and safe, and let their gentle sleep become our own. That, in the end, is the deepest truth of the first-class life aboard the Titanic, that it was a kind of perfect, gilded dream, a few days suspended outside the ordinary world, in which every comfort was provided, every want anticipated, every harsh edge of life smoothed away by money and machinery and the labor of unseen hundreds. For 5 days you might live as no one in history had ever quite lived, cradled in luxury upon the deep, wanting for nothing, fearing nothing, gliding toward a bright new world. It was the very summit of the confident, glittering, unequal age that built her, an age that believed, with all its heart, that human ingenuity had very nearly conquered nature itself, that progress had no limit, that a ship could be made unsinkable, and a life made safe by sheer wealth and cleverness. And it is precisely that golden confidence, that lovely dream of safety, that makes what we will not speak of tonight so piercing to remember. So let us not remember it. Let us keep the dream whole. And perhaps that is the gentlest and the truest way to hold the Titanic in the mind, here in the quiet before sleep, not as a wreck, but as a wonder, the most beautiful ship the world had ever seen, on the calm bright days when she was new, carrying her bright company across the spring ocean in a comfort that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Hold her there. The great black hull, and the four buff funnels against the blue, the decks full of strolling passengers in their furs, the orchestra playing in the palm court, the jewels glittering at dinner, the warm rooms, and the soft beds, and the deep, gentle throb of the engines carrying everyone safely on. Hold the people there too, in their happiness, the millionaire and the immigrant, the grand lady and the playing child, the bride on her honeymoon and the unsinkable woman who would one day take up an oar, all of them alive and hopeful and unafraid, gliding together through those last golden days. That is how they lived it. That is how they deserve to be remembered. And that is the picture we will carry with us, warm and shining, down into our own sleep tonight. And so we leave you there, on the last calm evening, the great ship gliding westward under a sky ablaze with stars, the sea utterly still and black and cold around her. We will not, tonight, follow the story to where it goes. You know it, and it is not a thing for the gentle hour before sleep. Let us leave the Titanic instead at the height of her glory, warm and bright and full of music, the most beautiful ship in the world, carrying her sleeping passengers across a quiet sea, every light aglow, the band's last waltz still hanging in the air. Hold her there in your mind, perfect and shining, as she was on those first golden days. And let us turn now, as we do each night, to the real women who walk those gilded decks, 3 first-class ladies who truly sailed on her, whose lives were as remarkable as the ship herself, and the first of whom the world would come to call Unsinkable. Long before she was famous as the unsinkable Molly Brown, she was Margaret Tobin, born not to wealth at all but to a poor Irish-American family in a little river town in Missouri, in a small house by the Mississippi, with no fortune and no prospects, and nothing at all to suggest that she would one day dine in first class on the most famous ship in the world and become an American legend. She grew up working from a young age, with only a little schooling, in a hard and humble world, and when she was still a young woman she went west, out to the rough silver and gold mining town of Leadville, high in the mountains of Colorado, to seek whatever fortune the frontier might offer a poor and ambitious girl. Her parents were Irish immigrants, poor and hard-working, who had crossed the ocean themselves in search of a better life and raised their children in modest circumstances on the banks of the great river, in a household rich in little but love and grit and the stubborn immigrant faith that a person might rise by their own effort. Young Margaret had only a few years of schooling before she went out to work, in a tobacco factory, by some accounts, as a girl, learning early the value of $1 and the weight of a long day's labor. She grew up sturdy and clever and full of life, with a warmth and a directness that never left her, and a burning wish for something larger than the narrow life the river bank seemed to offer. It is a beginning about as far from the grand staircase of the Titanic as it is possible to imagine, and that distance, that astonishing climb from a Missouri shanty to the gilded decks of the great liner, is the whole shape of her remarkable life. Few people in all of history have traveled so far from where they began, and almost no one has done it while remaining, so completely and so cheerfully, exactly who they always were. Leadville in those days was a raw, booming, brawling mining town, perched nearly 2 miles up in the thin cold air of the Rocky Mountains, a place of saloons and gambling halls, and sudden fortunes torn out of the silver and gold-laced rock, where men poured in from everywhere on earth to chase the dream of striking it rich. It was no place for the faint-hearted, and Margaret, who had come west with one of her brothers, took work where a young woman could find it, and lived the hard, plain life of the mining frontier. She had, by her own telling, every intention of marrying a rich man, for she had known poverty all her life and meant to escape it, and there in Leadville she fully expected to find one. Instead, she fell in love with a poor one, and married him for love, against her own sensible plans, and it would turn out to be the luckiest decision she ever made. In Leadville she met and married a man named James Joseph Brown, J.J., as everyone called him, a self-educated mining engineer, as poor as she was, a man of energy and ambition who was, like her, on the make in the booming Mountain West. They married for love, not money, and for a time they had little of the latter. But J.J. was clever and hard-working and lucky, and he rose in the mining world, and then came the stroke that changed everything. Through his skill and daring, J.J. played a key part in striking a vast seam of gold at one of the great Leadville mines, and almost overnight the poor young couple became enormously, fabulously rich. From a frontier cabin they were lifted, in a few short years, into a wealth beyond their wildest dreams. A grand house in Denver, a fortune to spend, the doors of society to batter upon. The poor Irish girl from the riverbank was now one of the richest women in Colorado, and she set about, with the same fierce energy that had carried her west, learning to live the part. They bought a grand Victorian mansion in Denver, filled it with treasures gathered from their travels, and Margaret threw herself into the life of a wealthy society woman with all the gusto of someone who had known the other side, and meant to enjoy every moment of this one. Yet the money never quite changed who she was at the core, the warm, blunt, energetic, generous frontier woman who had taken work as a girl and never forgotten what it was to have nothing. That memory, that sympathy with the struggling and the poor, would shape everything she did with her fortune. She gave, and worked, and championed the underdog all her life, because she had been the underdog, and she never let herself forget it. The marriage to J.J., for all that it had made her, did not last in the end as a close union. The two strong-willed partners eventually separated, though they never divorced and remained on civil terms. But the fortune it had brought gave Margaret the freedom to become the remarkable public woman she was destined to be. But Denver society, that small and snobbish world, did not quite know what to do with a loud, warm, energetic, self-made Margaret Brown, with her frontier manners and her brand-new money and her refusal to be quiet and small. She was not, at first, fully accepted by the established families, who looked down their noses at the newly rich miner's wife, and rather than shrink, Margaret simply made her own way, throwing herself into self-improvement and good works with tremendous gusto. She traveled the world, to Europe, to the great cities, soaking up culture and languages with the hungry enthusiasm of someone making up for a childhood that had given her none of it. She studied at length, immersed herself in literature and the arts, and remade herself, by sheer determination, into a cultivated and cosmopolitan woman who could hold her own in any society. And she turned that energy outward, into causes. She worked for women's suffrage, for the right to vote that she would champion all her life. She worked for the rights of workers and miners, remembering the hard world she and J.J. had climbed out of. She worked for children, for education, for the welfare of the poor. She helped found a hospital, raised money for good causes, and involved herself in the great reforming movements of the age with the same tireless drive she brought to everything. There is a particular sting in the story of her years among the Denver elite, for that small closed circle of old families, the self-appointed arbiters of who did and did not belong, looked upon the loud, warm, brand-new rich Mrs. Brown with a cold and snobbish disdain, and were slow, very slow, to open their drawing rooms to her. She had the money now, more than most of them. What she did not have, in their eyes, was breeding, polish, the right family, the right quiet manners, the long-established name. And rather than be crushed by it, or shrink herself to fit, Margaret set out quite deliberately to make herself their equal and more. She studied. She traveled the world. She learned French and other languages. She steeped herself in art and music and literature and the great questions of the day, transforming the rough frontier girl into a genuinely cultured and cosmopolitan woman. She threw open her own grand house for charity and for causes. She worked tirelessly for the right of women to vote, for the welfare of minors and their families, for poor children, for the building of hospitals and the relief of the suffering. If the snobs would not have her at their dinners, she would simply build a life so rich and so consequential that their approval became beside the point. She was a force of nature, generous and irrepressible, and entirely her own woman, and if the stuffiest doors of Denver stayed shut to her, she made her life so large and so useful that in the end it scarcely mattered. By the time she boarded the Titanic, she was a wealthy, cultured, much-traveled woman of the world, returning from a long trip abroad, and about to walk into the night that would make her a legend. For when the Titanic met her fate, Margaret Brown showed the whole world the steel that a hard frontier girlhood had put into her. Helped into one of the lifeboats, she found herself in a boat only partly full, rowing away from the stricken ship into the freezing dark, and where others sat frozen with shock and grief, Margaret took an oar, and took charge, and would not be still. She rowed. She rallied the frightened women around her. She argued fiercely with the crewmen in command that they should turn back to look for survivors in the water. She draped her own furs and clothing over those shivering in the cold, kept up the spirits of her boatload through the long and terrible night, and bullied and cheered them all toward the dawn. The boat she was in pulled away into a night of unimaginable cold and darkness, the stars blazing overhead, the sea black and still, the great ship blazing with light behind them, and slowly, impossibly, tilting toward the water. The man in charge of her boat, one of the ship's crewmen, was gripped by despair and by fear, fear that the boat would be swamped, fear of the suction when the ship went down, fear of the freezing people in the water, and he wished to row away and save themselves and not go back. And it was Margaret who stood against him, who took up an oar herself and set the women to rowing to keep warm and keep their courage, who argued furiously that they must turn back for survivors, who at one point, by some accounts, threatened to throw the frightened officer overboard if he would not let them try. She kept that boatload of shocked and grieving women alive through the long hours of the night by sheer force of will, rowing, warming, scolding, comforting, refusing to let despair win. Many in the boat had left husbands and sons behind on the ship. They sat stunned with cold and grief in the darkness, watching the lights of the great liner tilt and dim, and finally vanish beneath the sea, listening to the sounds that came across the water afterward and that none of them would ever forget. And through all of it Margaret was a rock, practical, fierce, tireless, taking off her own warm things to wrap around those who shook with cold, setting the women to the oars to keep their blood moving and their minds off the horror, talking, encouraging, refusing to let the boat sink into the silence of despair. She had known hardship. She had known the cold. She had the strength of a woman who had built herself up from nothing, and on that worst of nights she spent every ounce of it on the strangers in her boat. And when at last the rescue ship Carpathia plucked them from the sea at dawn, she did not rest. She set to work at once among the survivors, organizing aid, comforting the bereaved, using her languages to help the frightened foreign passengers of steerage who had lost husbands and children and everything they owned, drawing up lists, and raising thousands of dollars among the wealthy survivors before the ship even reached New York, so that the poorest among them would not step ashore into a strange country with nothing at all. Here her hard-won education and her warm heart came together to magnificent effect. She spoke several languages, and she used them to move among the terrified foreign women of steerage who had lost everything and could not even make themselves understood, comforting them, learning their needs, taking down their names, carrying their grief. While some of the grand first-class survivors kept to themselves in shock, Margaret simply rolled up her sleeves and went to work for the most helpless people aboard, organizing a survivors' committee on the spot and shaming the rich into giving generously. By the time the Carpathia reached New York, she had already raised a substantial relief fund, and she did not stop at the dockside, but went on working for the survivors, and for the families of the lost crewmen, and for the memory of the dead, for years afterward. The night that might have left a lesser person broken left Margaret Brown energized with purpose, and she poured that purpose out upon everyone the disaster had wounded. Her energy and courage through that ordeal became famous the world over, and the press, delighted, gave her the name that would outlive her, the unsinkable Mrs. Brown. She rather enjoyed the fame, it must be said, and used it without shame, for she understood, shrewdly, that a famous name was a tool, and she wielded hers for every good cause she could attach it to, turning the world's fascination with the heroine of the lifeboat into money and attention for the survivors, the bereaved, the workers, the women's vote, and the dozen other causes she championed. The grand Denver families, who had once snubbed the loud new-money miner's wife, now found her a national heroine, celebrated across 2 continents, a delicious irony that Margaret, one suspects, savored to the full. She had wanted, once, to be accepted by society. In the end, society's approval had become beside the point, for she had made herself something far larger than any drawing room could contain. She lived on for 20 more years, and she filled them as fully as she had filled all the rest. She used her new fame for good, championing the survivors and the causes she believed in. She chaired the survivors' committee, helped raise money for a memorial, and made sure the courage of the crewmen and the needs of the bereaved were not forgotten. She ran for public office, for the United States Senate, no less, years before most American women could even vote, a startling ambition for a woman of her day. When the Great War came, she went to France and threw herself into relief work, helping the wounded and the devastated, working with the American and French relief efforts, organizing aid and comfort for soldiers and refugees with the same tireless energy she had once spent on the survivors in the lifeboat, for which a grateful France made her a recipient of the Legion d'honneur, one of the nation's highest honors. She had a particular gift, it seems, for being most fully herself in a crisis. Where catastrophe paralyzed others, it seemed only to call up in Margaret some deep reserve of practical courage and warmth, so that again and again, from the freezing lifeboat to the battlefields of France, she was the one who rolled up her sleeves and did what needed doing. It was as though all the hard years of her youth, all the poverty and the struggle and the snubs, had forged in her exactly the strength that the great emergencies of her later life would demand, and she spent that strength, freely and joyfully, on whoever needed it most. She befriended artists and actors, including the great Sarah Bernhardt, and in her later years even tried her own hand at the stage. The press had given her the immortal nickname, and the legend grew and grew, until decades after her death it would be spun into a hit musical and a film. The Unsinkable Molly Brown, that fixed her forever in the American imagination, though the real woman was richer and stranger and braver than any legend, and her own first name was not even Molly at all, but Margaret. She was honored by France for her tireless charity, and beloved by all who knew her for her warmth. She died in 1932, some 20 years after the night that made her famous, and the grand Denver mansion she had once filled with treasure stands to this day as a museum to her memory, a monument to the poor Irish girl who climbed all the way from a Missouri River town to the front pages of the world. And perhaps that is the truest measure of her, that of all the wealthy, titled, glittering passengers who sailed in first class on the Titanic, it is the one who began with nothing, the loud, warm, self-made woman the snobs would not quite admit to their drawing rooms, whom the world chose to remember and to love, not for her money, of which she had a great deal, but for her courage and her kindness, and the unsinkable spirit that took up an oar in the dark and would not give in. Hold her in your mind as you drift, the unsinkable woman, rowing through the night, draping her furs over strangers, refusing, to the very last, to be anything less than equal to whatever the world threw at her. She was, to the end, exactly what she had always been, generous, fearless, larger than life, a poor girl from a Missouri River town who had climbed all the way to the gilded decks of the Titanic and the front pages of the world, and who, when the great ship went down beneath her, simply took up an oar and rowed. Hold her in your mind as you drift, the unsinkable woman, rowing through the dark, draping her furs over strangers, refusing, to the very last, to be anything less than equal to the night. Let her rest now in your thoughts, the unsinkable woman, rowing through the cold, and let us turn to a second of the great ship's first-class ladies, as different from Margaret as could be, and yet, like her, a woman who had built herself up by sheer talent from difficult beginnings. But where Margaret's night aboard the Titanic gave her a legend to carry proudly all her days, this woman's night would give her instead a shadow she could never quite escape, for fame and infamy, on that terrible ocean, were separated by the thinnest of margins, and not everyone who climbed into a lifeboat climbed out of it with their good name intact. She had also risen by her own gift, in a glittering world of silk and scandal, and her story is the story of how a brilliant career can be forever marked by a single hour. Long before she was Lady Duff-Gordon, she was Lucy Sutherland, a clever, artistic, strong-willed Englishwoman who, through nothing but her own gift and grit, became one of the most celebrated fashion designers of her age, and very nearly the first true celebrity designer the world had ever known. Her beginnings were not grand and her early life was hard. A first marriage ended unhappily and left her a divorced woman with a child to support in an age that had little mercy for such a position. It is worth pausing on how hard and how precarious that position was. A divorced woman in late Victorian England was a figure under a cloud, whispered about, excluded, her respectability in question through no real fault of her own, and a divorced woman with a young daughter and little money was in real difficulty, for the genteel professions open to ladies were few and poorly paid, and to fall in the world was terribly easy, and to climb back terribly hard. Lucy had been raised with some refinement but no fortune, and now she had to find a way to keep herself and her child without the protection of a husband or a family purse. What she had was taste, a true, instinctive, original sense of beauty and style, and a will as strong as iron. And so, needing to make her own way, Lucy did something remarkable for a woman of her time. She began, quietly, by making dresses at home, then opened a small dressmaking enterprise, and discovered in herself a genius for fashion that would carry her to the very top of London society. Interestingly, beauty and boldness ran in the family, for her sister was the famous and scandalous romantic novelist Elinor Glyn, whose daring books shocked and delighted the age. Two sisters, each in her own way, making a name by their wits and their nerve in a world that did not make it easy for women to do either. Elinor's romantic novels, with their daring heroines and their famous talk of a certain indefinable allure, she called it, scandalized the respectable and sold by the cartload, and she would go on, in time, to Hollywood, helping to shape the very idea of the screen siren. And there was a shared streak in the sisters of boldness, of glamour, of refusing to accept the small quiet life that society laid out for a woman, a willingness to be talked about, to be conspicuous, to live largely and on their own terms. In Lucy that streak ran into fashion, into the creation of beauty and the staging of glamour, in Elinor into scandalous fiction, but it was the same fire in both, the same refusal to be ordinary, and it carried each of them, from beginnings that gave them nothing, to fame on both sides of the Atlantic. And what Lucy built was not merely a dress shop but a revolution. She understood, as few did then, that a gown was not just cloth but emotion, romance, a story a woman told about herself, and she designed accordingly, creating dresses of soft, flowing, sensuous beauty, in delicate colors and luxurious fabrics, that broke from the stiff and armored fashions of the past. She gave her creations evocative, poetic names, as though each were a character or a mood. She pioneered beautiful, daring lingerie at a time when underthings were purely practical. And above all, she transformed the way fashion was shown to the world, where dressmakers had once simply displayed garments on dummies or draped them over a chair. Lucy staged proper presentations, dim the lights, raise a little curtain stage, play soft music, and send out beautiful living girls, trained to walk with grace and poise, to parade her gowns before an invited audience. She is, by many accounts, the woman who invented the fashion show and the professional fashion model, the whole theatrical machinery of glamour that the world now takes for granted. From a frightened divorced woman sewing at home, she had conjured an entire new way of selling beauty. Her great house of fashion, which she called Lucile, became one of the most famous in the world. Lucy had a true artist's eye and a flair for the theatrical, and she revolutionized the way fashion was made and sold. She created gowns of romantic, flowing, sensuous beauty, gave them evocative names, and showed them in a way no one had before, staging elaborate fashion parades, with proper lighting and music and a stage, training beautiful young women to glide along it displaying her creations, in effect inventing the fashion show and the professional model as we know them. She dressed duchesses and actresses and royalty. She opened branches of Lucile in New York and Paris and Chicago, building an international fashion house at a time when such a thing run by a woman was almost unheard of. She clothed the great stars of the London and New York stage in their most famous roles, so that to wear a Lucile gown became a mark of glamour and daring. She designed for famous beauties and society hostesses, for theatrical spectacles and grand occasions. her romantic, flowing creations setting the tone for an entire era of fashion. Her gowns were unlike anything that had come before, soft, layered, romantic confections in dreamy colors, draped to flatter and to flow, sensuous where the old fashions had been stiff, individual where they had been uniform. She believed a dress should express the soul of the woman who wore it, and she designed each as a kind of portrait. She dressed some of the most famous and beautiful women of the age, on the stage and off it, and to be gowned by Lucile was to be marked as a woman of daring and taste. She wrote about style, advised women on how to dress to express themselves, and became a public personality in her own right, one of the first women to turn personal taste into a global brand. It was an extraordinary achievement for any designer, and a near miraculous one for a woman who had begun as a penniless divorcee sewing to feed her child. And it was at the very height of all this success, famous and sought after on both sides of the Atlantic, that she stepped aboard the Titanic to sail to her thriving American business. From a struggling divorced dressmaker, she had made herself an international name, a woman of wealth and fame and influence in her own right, and along the way she had married again, this time to a Scottish baronet, Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon, and become Lady Duff-Gordon, a title to crown her hard-won success. And so it was as Lady Duff-Gordon, a celebrated designer at the height of her fame, that she and Sir Cosmo boarded the Titanic under assumed names, traveling first class, bound for her thriving business in New York. They were exactly the sort of glittering, accomplished passengers the first-class world was made for. But the night the ship went down, Lucy and Cosmo found themselves at the center of one of the disaster's most painful and most lasting controversies. The boat they escaped in would become infamous, mocked in the press ever after as the money boat, or the millionaire's boat, for the smallness of its load and the wealth of some aboard it. They were helped into one of the very first boats to leave, and here is the heart of the trouble, for it was one of the small emergency boats, built to hold perhaps 40 people, and it was lowered away into the dark carrying only 12 souls, in a boat with room for 40, pulling away from a sinking ship that still held more than 1,000 people who would shortly be in the freezing water. It was not, of course, the Duff-Gordons' doing that the boat left so empty. The loading of the boats that night was chaotic, rushed, and terribly mismanaged, and many went down half-filled because the crew feared they would buckle if fully loaded, or simply could not find passengers willing, in those first unbelieving minutes, to leave the warm, bright ship for a tiny boat on a black sea. But the image of it, the famous couturière and her baronet husband, gliding away to safety in a boat with 28 empty seats, would prove impossible to live down. And in the bitter aftermath, when the world demanded to know why so many boats had left so empty while hundreds drowned, an ugly accusation attached itself to the Duff-Gordons, that Sir Cosmo had offered money to the crewmen in their boat, and that this had something to do with the boat's failure to return to pick up survivors from the water. The matter became a public scandal of the first order, aired at the official inquiry into the disaster, with Lucy and Sir Cosmo actually called to give evidence, a most unusual and humiliating ordeal for passengers, who were generally not summoned to account for their conduct in the boats. The newspapers seized upon it with relish, for here was human drama to give a face to the vast abstract horror of 1,500 dead, the glamorous fashion queen and her titled husband, accused in the public mind of buying their way to safety while the poor drowned. Every word of their testimony was pored over. The sum Sir Cosmo had given the crewmen, a few pounds to each man, was turned over and examined as though it were the very price of the lives lost. The couple insisted, and went on insisting all their lives, that it was simply a gift to sailors who had lost their kit and their wages with the ship, an act of ordinary kindness in a moment of chaos. And to stand and be questioned, in public, before a solemn tribunal and the avid eyes of the world's press, about one's own conduct on the worst night of one's life, to have one's terror and one's survival picked over and doubted and turned into a story of selfishness, was a kind of ordeal in itself, a second wound laid over the first. Whatever the truth of that night, and the evidence on the whole favored them, the Duff-Gordons paid a heavy price in reputation for the simple, human fact of having been among the saved while so many were lost. It is one of the crueler lessons of the disaster, that survival itself, for some, came wrapped in a lifelong suspicion, and that the public which had cheered the heroism of the night needed its villains too, and was not over-careful about whom it cast in the part. The matter became a public scandal, aired at the official inquiry into the disaster, the newspapers full of it. The Duff-Gordons maintained that the money Sir Cosmo gave the crewmen was simply a gift to men who had lost everything in the wreck, an act of kindness, and not a bribe, and the inquiry did not formally find them guilty of any wrongdoing. But the damage was done. In the public mind a shadow clung to them, the suggestion that the rich couple had saved themselves in a near-empty boat and rowed away from the drowning, and it followed Lucy for the rest of her life. It is worth being fair to her, as the inquiry in the end largely was. There is no good evidence that the money kept anyone from being saved. The boat was already away from the ship when the gift was promised, and a frightened woman climbing into a lifeboat she was offered did nothing that the rules of women first did not positively demand of her. And one ought to remember, too, the simple human terror of that night, which the comfortable judgments of afterwards so easily forget. Lucy was a woman in middle age, in poor health, roused in the freezing dark to be told the Unsinkable ship was sinking, hurried up to the boat deck into a scene of dawning chaos, and handed down into a tiny boat swinging 70 feet above a black sea. She did as she was told. She climbed in. The boat was lowered and rowed away on the orders of the crew. There was no moment, in the confusion of those minutes, when anyone fully grasped that the ship would truly founder and that 1,500 people would die. That knowledge came only later, with the dawn and the counting. To climb into an offered lifeboat was the most natural act in the world, and exactly what the rule of women and children first demanded of her. But fairness and public feeling are two different things, and the public, hungry for villains in so vast a tragedy, found in the rich, famous, half-empty boat Duff-Gordons a story too neat to relinquish. Her career went on. Lucile remained celebrated for some years more, dressing the famous and shaping the fashions of a generation. But the world was changing. The Great War swept away the lavish, corseted, romantic style she embodied. Tastes turned simpler and more modern, and her business, overextended across several countries, eventually faltered, slipped from her control, and was lost. Her later years were quieter and sadder, lived in reduced circumstances and failing health, dimmed always by that lingering cloud from the night of the sinking. She wrote her memoirs in time, and looked back on the extraordinary arc of her life, the hard beginnings, the soaring success, the glamour and the fame and the terrible shadow, with a mixture of pride and pain. She had been one of the most influential women of her age in her field, a true original who changed how the whole world thought about clothes and beauty and display, and she knew it, and yet she knew, too, that her name would forever be linked, in the public mind, less with her genius than with one freezing night and one half-empty boat, a thing she had not truly done wrong and could never quite undo. There is something deeply human and deeply sad in that, to have built so much, and to be remembered for an hour of terror over which you had no real control. Let her rest in your thoughts as the artist she was, the penniless divorced woman who invented the fashion show and dressed the queens of the stage, and who carried, beneath all her hard-won glamour, a wound the sea had given her that never fully healed. She died in the 1930s, her great fame faded, her fortune gone, living quietly and modestly at the end, a world away from the dazzling heights of the house of Lucile in its prime. And there is a real injustice in how she is remembered, for her true legacy is enormous. The modern fashion show, the professional model, the idea of clothes as romance and self-expression, the whole theatrical glamour of the fashion world that endures to this day, all of it owes a debt to the brilliant, driven, self-made Lucy. She had built herself up from nothing to dress the queens of the stage and society, a true pioneer whose ideas shaped fashion for a century. And yet, she is remembered too often only for those terrible hours in a half-empty boat. Let her rest more gently in your thoughts tonight. The brilliant, driven woman who invented the very idea of the fashion show, and who carried, ever after, a sorrow the sea had given her. Let Lucy rest now too, with her beautiful gowns and her lasting sorrow, and let us turn at the last to the youngest of our three, and in some ways the most poignant of all. For if Margaret was the heroine of that night, and Lucy its shadowed survivor, this final lady was simply its broken-hearted child. She had not built an empire or earned a fortune. She had done nothing at all but be young and pretty and fall in love with a much older and very famous man. She was a girl barely more than a child, married into the greatest fortune in America, who came aboard the Titanic a radiant new bride and left it, a few nights later, a widow not yet out of her teens. Long before she was the tragic young Mrs. Astor, she was Madeleine Force, a pretty, well-bred, but otherwise ordinary American girl of 18, the daughter of a comfortable New York family, with no notion at all that her name was about to be joined to one of the most famous fortunes in the world. She had been raised in comfort but not in grandeur, the daughter of a respectable New York family of the merely well-off sort, given the ordinary upbringing of a young lady of her class, taught to be charming and accomplished and marriageable, and pointed, as such girls were, toward a good match in due course. Nothing in that gentle, conventional girlhood could have prepared her for what was coming, that before she was 20 she would be the wife of one of the richest men alive, the talk of 2 continents, a widow, a mother, and a figure in the most famous shipwreck in history. For Madeleine had caught the eye of John Jacob Astor IV, Colonel Astor, as he was known, and there was scarcely a more famous or more glittering name in all of America. The Astors were old money of the grandest kind. Their vast fortune founded generations before in furs, and then multiplied beyond counting in New York real estate, until they owned great swaths of Manhattan and stood at the very pinnacle of American society. The Colonel himself was a remarkable man, not merely an heir, but an inventor, and a businessman, and even a writer, who had patented devices, built the magnificent Astoria Hotel that joined his cousins to form the famous Waldorf Astoria, and published a science fiction novel imagining the future. He had served in the Spanish-American War, which gave him his title of colonel. He was, by the reckoning of the day, one of the very richest men in the world, his wealth almost beyond imagining. And he was, when he met Madeleine, a man of nearly 50 who had recently been through a divorce, a thing so frowned upon in their rigid society that it had cost him much of his standing even with all his millions. She was, by all accounts, a sweet and gentle and unaffected girl, pretty and well-mannered and modest, with none of the hardness or ambition one might expect of a young woman who married a fortune, and indeed it seems to have been a genuine attachment between them, the lonely middle-aged man and the warm young girl, however the world chose to sneer at it. And the colonel, smitten, had married the teenage Madeleine, some 30 years his junior, in a match that set the gossips of 2 continents alight. The honeymoon that followed carried them far from the whispering, through Egypt, where they wandered among the temples and the pyramids, and on through Europe, a long, leisurely, golden tour of the kind that only the very rich could afford, the older man showing his young bride the wonders of the world, the 2 of them living quietly abroad while the storm of disapproval blew itself out at home. It should have been the gentle beginning of a long and comfortable marriage. Instead, it was very nearly the whole of it, for the journey home from that honeymoon would end on the deck of a sinking ship, and the marriage that had scandalized society would last, in the end, only a handful of months. For the marriage was a scandal, by the rigid standards of their society. Astor was divorced, which polite society frowned upon severely. His bride was young enough to be his daughter, and the union was whispered about, disapproved of, and snubbed in some of the very drawing-rooms where the Astor name had always reigned supreme. The disapproval was real, and it was loud. That a man of nearly 50, and divorced, should marry a girl of 18, younger than his own son, struck respectable society as very nearly indecent, and the newspapers and drawing-rooms buzzed with it. Some clergymen refused to perform the ceremony, and the couple were snubbed in quarters where the Astor name had always opened every door. To escape the worst of the gossip, and to let the talk die down, the newlyweds did what wealthy couples did. They went abroad, on a long honeymoon through Egypt and Europe, far from the wagging tongues of New York. The wedding itself had been a quiet, almost furtive affair, for so many clergymen had refused, on grounds of the colonel's divorce, to marry the couple at all that finding someone willing to perform this ceremony became its own small ordeal. In the end they were married privately, away from the great society wedding that the Astor name would ordinarily have commanded, the disapproval of their world hanging over the whole occasion. And it was on their journey home from the long honeymoon that followed, Madeleine now expecting their first child, that they booked first-class passage aboard the magnificent new liner everyone was talking about, to sail home at last to America to await the birth. By the time they boarded, Madeleine was expecting their first child, and the couple were eager to be home in America for the birth, the long exile of the honeymoon having served its purpose of letting the worst of the scandal cool. They came aboard the Titanic as the most glamorous of couples, the immensely rich, famous, middle-aged colonel and his pretty, gentle, very young pregnant bride, traveling in the grandest style, with their servants and their luggage and the colonel's pet dog, taking the finest of accommodation the great ship could offer. They were precisely the kind of golden, glittering passengers the first-class world existed to flatter, and they had every reason in the world to expect a swift and splendid crossing into a happy future, the gossip behind them, the child ahead, the great fortune to come home to, and the most famous ship in the world to carry them there in perfect comfort and perfect safety. No 2 passengers aboard, perhaps, had brighter prospects, or less reason to fear what the dark water ahead of them held. For the first days of the crossing they lived the quiet, contented life of a wealthy honeymoon couple coming home, Madeleine resting in their grand suite in her delicate condition, the colonel attentive and protective, the 2 of them keeping somewhat to themselves, a little apart from the social whirl, as befitted a couple still under a faint cloud and a young wife expecting a child. They walked the deck together. They dined. They looked forward, no doubt, to the arrival in New York, the birth of the baby, the long-settled future that lay so plainly before them. It was, by every appearance, the gentle beginning of an ordinary happiness, the scandal fading behind them, the great fortune and the new child waiting ahead. It was not to be. When the ship struck and began to founder, Colonel Astor saw his young wife safely into a lifeboat, and then, the survivor said, asked whether he might join her, given her delicate condition, and was told that no, the men must wait. And so he stepped back, with a composure that the survivors never forgot. By the accounts that came down, the colonel behaved through those last hours with perfect, quiet courage, seeing his young wife wrapped warmly and handed into the boat, asking his calm question and accepting the answer without protest, and then simply standing back on the tilting deck among the other men, lighting a cigarette, by one account, and waiting. He helped Madeleine settle into the boat, spoke a few quiet words to her, told her he would see her later in New York, and stood back on the sloping deck as the boat was lowered away into the dark, the richest man aboard, who could have bought the whole ship many times over, and whose millions could not buy him a place that the code of that night reserved for the women and children. He was one of the many men who gave up their places and did not survive, and his fortune availed him nothing at all against the sea. Madeleine was saved. The richest man on the ship was not. She was brought aboard the rescue ship, an 18-year-old widow carrying a child who would never know its father, and she came home not to the joyful arrival she had imagined but to a nation in mourning, and a name now bound forever to the great disaster. Picture her in that boat, if you can bear it gently, 18 years old, expecting a child, pulling away across the freezing black water, looking back at the brilliant tilting ship where she had left the husband who had told her, only minutes before, that he would see her soon. She was rescued at dawn by the Carpathia, lifted half frozen from the open boat after a night no one who lived through it could ever describe. And she came home not to the joyful arrival the young couple had planned but to a quay thronged with weeping crowds, and a nation plunged into mourning, a girl widow stepping ashore alone into a blaze of newspaper attention, her famous husband's body somewhere in the cold Atlantic behind her. The contrast could hardly have been crueler. She had left America under a cloud of scandal, the disapproved of teenage bride. She returned a figure of national tragedy and sympathy, the pregnant widow of the richest man on the lost ship. Her story after that is a quieter one, touched throughout by that single catastrophic night. She gave birth, that summer, only a few months after the disaster, to the son the colonel had not lived to see, a boy who came into the world already fatherless, his father's death the most public tragedy of the age, the great Astor name passing to an infant born of catastrophe. And under the terms of her husband's will Madeleine inherited the use of a great fortune and a fine home, but on one condition, a condition that reveals so much about the world she lived in, that she should keep it only so long as she never remarried. The dead man's hand reached out, in other words, to bind his teenage widow to his memory for the rest of her natural life, on pain of forfeiting everything. She might keep the Astor wealth, or she might keep her freedom to love again, but she could not have both. For a few years the young widow lived as society expected, raising her child, keeping the Astor name. She bore the child bravely, the survivor said, through a pregnancy shadowed by grief and by the relentless attention of a fascinated public. Every detail of the famous young widow's condition followed in the press. She named the boy John Jacob Astor, the sixth to carry that great name, a child of the famous disaster, born to a mother not yet 20, his first cried the long-awaited end of a story the whole world had been watching. The newspapers made much of him, this infant heir conceived on a honeymoon and born of catastrophe, his father drowned before he ever drew breath, and Madeleine, scarcely more than a girl herself, became a mother in the glare of a sympathy so vast and so public that it must, at times, have felt like another kind of burden. For a few years she lived as the will required, the young dowager of the Astor house, raising her son and her stepson and keeping faith with the dead. But she was very young, with most of her life still before her, and the prospect of decades of solitude, bound by a dead man's condition, was a heavy thing to ask of a girl of 19. And in time she chose, bravely, to give up the great Astor fortune and the grand house rather than spend her whole youth alone, walking away from one of the largest inheritances in America, surrendering it all, in order to marry again and seek the ordinary human happiness that the Titanic had so nearly taken from her. It was, when you think of it, a quietly courageous choice, to choose love and freedom over a vast fortune, to refuse to spend her one youth as a monument to a dead man's memory, to insist on living a life of her own rather than the gilded half-life the will laid out for her. Most of the world would have clung to the Astor millions. The young widow let them go, and stepped down from the great name into ordinary life, in search of a happiness that money had never been able to buy her. That she did not, in the end, quite find it, that her later marriages brought their own disappointments, and that her life was cut short while she was still young, does not diminish the bravery of the choice. She had been handed, at 18, a fortune purchased with the deepest grief, and she had the courage to value her own heart above it. She married again, more than once, in the years that followed, searching for the settled happiness that had been so cruelly snatched from her, but the marriages did not bring her lasting peace, and her health was never strong, and one cannot help feeling that something in her had been wounded past full healing on that April night when she was 18. Her later life had its further sorrows, and was not, in the end, a long one. She died still a relatively young woman, not yet 50, the girl who had been for one glittering season the bride of the richest man in America, and then, in a single freezing night, his widow. The son she carried off the sinking ship lived on to carry the great name into another generation, but Madeleine herself slipped quietly out of the world's attention, remembered chiefly for those few hours in the lowering boat, the youngest and most fragile of all the famous women the Titanic touched, a child really, who had her whole bright future remade into grief in the time it takes a great ship to fill with water and slip beneath the sea. Hold her gently as sleep comes near. The 18-year-old in the lowering boat, looking up at the husband she would never see again, carried away across the black water into a future she had never asked for and could not have foreseen. 3 women, then, and 3 fates spun out of the same April night. Margaret, the poor girl turned millionaire turned legend, who met the disaster with an oar in her hands and her chin up, and carried the memory of it as a badge of courage all her days. Lucile, the brilliant self-made artist who addressed the queens of the stage, and who carried her night aboard the Titanic ever after as a quiet shame she had never truly earned. And Madeleine, scarcely more than a child, who came aboard with everything before her, and went home with her young husband lost beneath the sea and her whole bright life turned, in a few hours, to grief. They had so little in common, a frontier philanthropist, a London couturier, a teenage American bride, save the great ship that gathered them up for those few gilded days, and then scattered their fortunes forever. And behind them stand all the others, the hundreds of women who walked those decks, and the men, and the children, and the unseen crew, each with a story the sea either spared or swallowed. That is the strange power the Titanic still holds over us, that beneath the marble, and the chandeliers, and the legend, it was only people, hopeful, ordinary, extraordinary people, living their one brief life, who stepped aboard a beautiful ship on a bright spring morning with no idea at all of what the calm sea ahead of them held. And so we leave the Titanic and the gilded women who sailed on her, the unsinkable Margaret, rowing through the dark, the brilliant, shadowed Lucy and her house of beautiful gowns, and young Madeleine, the bride who became a widow between 1 hour and the next. Let the great ship sail on now, forever, through the calm bright days before that final night, warm and golden and full of music, the most beautiful thing that ever crossed the sea, every window aglow, the orchestra playing on. There is nothing more for you to do tonight, and nowhere you must be. So let the lights of the great liner blur and soften in your mind, and let the gentle throb of her engines become the sound of your own slow breathing, carrying you down and down towards sleep. Let the past hold you warm and safe, far from any cold or any sea. Close your eyes now. Sweet dreams. We'll meet again tomorrow night.